very good morning to all of you. So my name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director at DGAP, the German Council on Foreign Relations. And it's really a pleasure to host this morning briefing today. We are back from the summer break and we do want to go back with our weekly briefings brought to you by the Research Institute of the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. We want to broaden a little bit our briefing. It was very much a briefing focused on the war, and obviously the war will continue to remain on the very top of our agenda. But we do want to broaden the scope, meaning that other pressing and far-reaching geopolitical issues will be part of this weekly conversation that we will have as of now, so including, of course, issues such as geopolitical tensions in the Asia Pacific and many other pressing and far-reaching events. But today we really want to focus again on Ukraine, on the war, on the situation, and on where the situation will go further. And the idea of today was to get the perspective not just from Germany, but also from two very important EU countries that are close allies to Germany, and that, of course, together are the engine room, if I can say so, the heart and the motor of the European efforts in supporting Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. Let me start sharing my screen. I will kick us off and also introduce our speakers. So the idea today was to talk about Germany, France, and Italy, and our take on the war and our support for Ukraine, and of course trying also to quantify the support and thinking about what could be done to improve, if necessary, the support to Ukraine. And as you know, Germany, France, and Italy, all three have clearly condemned the unjustified and brutal Russian war against Ukraine. The leaders of the three countries traveled to Kiev. It was a very important moment when they traveled on train to Kiev and pledged their support. But of course, a lot has happened politically since that trip, including the fact that Mario Draghi is not anymore the Prime Minister of Italy. So we want to explore how the dynamics there could change. In Germany, and let me give a few remarks on Germany, obviously Chancellor Scholz embarked early on a visionary Zeitenwende, so epochal change, or however we want to translate that into English. And he has reconfirmed in his recent speech in Prague the commitment to Germany's commitment to Eastern European security and the long-term support to help Ukraine build its air defense system, for example, and increase its military capacities. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, in a recent article, also clearly highlights that Putin's Russia will remain a threat for security and peace, and pledges further support. Yet, and I think in this room, we do want to spend some time to also discuss the doubts and the open questions. And many questions, of course, remain and have been very strong in the debate on whether actual support already delivered to Ukraine is sufficient. Data show that in comparative terms, the three biggest EU countries haven't actually delivered that much support in terms of military support, military aid. In the financial support, the pictures look a little bit better. And the substantial worry is how politics may change in the coming months. And so we will discuss this today with Nathalie Tocci. She is the director of our counterpart in Italy, the Istituto, the Affari Internazionali, so International Institute for International Affairs in Rome, and a honorary professor at the University of Tübingen. And Shahin Vallée is a senior fellow and head of program at DGAP, and is of course French, and I think knows and covers the French situation really, really well. So before I give Nathalie the floor, I did want to show you some slides on the doubts that emerge and that have emerged on the actual support already delivered, and the questions, and show you some of the question marks. And so to start off with, let me show a few data from the Kiel Institute of the World Economy Ukraine support tracker. This is a tracker that is regularly updated. These data are from the latest edition, which I think has the cutoff date August 3. And it looks at military, humanitarian, and financial aid assistance to Ukraine. And what we can see from this broad picture is that the United States is of course the largest bilateral supporter of Ukraine, but of course European institutions together with the main countries do provide quite a bit of support as well. And if you combine the contributions of the various EU institutions and countries, it comes not quite, it doesn't reach quite the United States level, but it does reach significant support levels that look more convincing than if you look at each country individually. So the EU institutions themselves, of course, do not provide much military, cannot provide much military aid, but do provide a lot of financial aid. I think the main worry that I think has been voiced is of course in the area of actual military aid, and here you see that the actual military aid is quite small compared to what the United States is delivering. And if we zoom in on the military aid specifically, and we look at, in particular, on the delivered military in-kind aid, so not the committed one, but the delivered one, you see this picture, which shows that the US and Poland are the two leading donors of actual military equipment to Ukraine, followed by the United Kingdom. And then in a far distance, we have actually Germany, France, and Italy. And in fact, if you add up the contribution of Germany, France, and Italy, so the three countries we want to look at today, together, Germany, France, and Italy have delivered less than half the value of military material than what Poland has actually delivered. So it's actually, for the size of those three countries, it's actually quite small, the actual military support that has been delivered. The pledges, however, are significantly higher in some cases. So of course, the military aid goes beyond the equipment aid. There is also financial aid with a military purpose, and there the picture looks a little bit better. Poland hasn't provided so much, but Germany has, but France and Italy also haven't delivered that much. Let's talk for 1 second about the budgetary support. I mean, in the budgetary support, which is going to be absolutely crucial as Ukraine goes into the winter, the budgetary support is significant. The budgetary support delivered by the EU, however, is much smaller than what has actually been committed. So let's just compare these numbers. The disbursed budgetary support is 3.1 billion. While the commitment exceeds the 12 billion. So we might very quickly run into a situation where Ukraine will actually start having serious cash flow issues. So I think this issue, and Shahin, I think, will focus a little bit more on this aspect. This issue, I think, will be quite important. So let me stop here with my presentation. I thought it would be useful to just start off with some of those numbers. And of course, these numbers can always be debated, but I do think they paint a picture of, in particular in military terms, a hesitant three big countries of the EU. And given the many political shocks that may arise in the coming months, I think we do have to think about what will be the strategy of sustaining the support for Ukraine, especially during the more difficult winter months. So that was my introductory remarks. Thank you so much. And Nathalie, we very much look forward to your remarks and then to Shahin, and then of course open up for the discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Guntram, and it's absolutely great to be at DGAP, and especially to be at DGAP in this new incarnation of Guntram. So it's the first event that we do together, Guntram, with you as director of the Institute. So perhaps let me start off with a couple of words on where I think we are in terms of the war, and then kind of connect it to, I think, many of the remarks, Guntram, that you were making, and then sort of zooming in a little bit on the Italian case. And this is really going to be a sort of story of a glass half full and a glass half empty. And let me begin with what I think is actually the glass half full. You know, I think we're now at a stage of the war in which, on the one hand, which in many respects you could actually say, well, it's better than what we thought a couple of months ago. So not simply, you know, 5 or 6 months ago after the initial sort of failure of, in a sense, plan A of Russia's invasion, gobbling up the whole of Ukraine in a couple of days. We then moved into a phase of, okay, you know, plan B, i.e. that of, you know, sort of Russia's occupation of the east and possibly of the south. You know, we you know, essentially thought, well, maybe that might work for the Russians. I think now we're at a stage in which essentially it looks like Russia has, in terms of its military capacities, I mean, it doesn't probably have many other rabbits to pull out of the hat. So we are in a situation in which Russia's military capacities will probably start going down as we move forward. And on the other hand, Ukrainians' military capacities, which of course, and this kind of ties back to the issue of military support, seem to be going up. Now, this doesn't mean to say that, for instance, the counteroffensive that we're seeing now in Kherson is going to, you know, in kind of blitzkrieg fashion, going to lead to the liberation of southern Ukraine. But I think basically what we're looking at is a trend which will play out over many, many months, not many weeks, but many months, of Russia's capacities gradually decreasing, and question mark, because again, you know, this ties to what we were talking about earlier, Ukrainians' capacity gradually increasing. So I think, you know, this is, in a sense, a kind of a scenario which in structural terms is not, I think is a better scenario than what we feared, you know, I would say in June, beginning of July, when it looked like there was this perhaps gradual but constant Russian military advance. Now, of course, you know, what I've just said holds water to the extent that support for Ukraine by the West, including by Europeans, continues over the course of many months. And as we know, I think the bargain and the bet that Putin is making is that this won't be the case. And it won't be the case because we will crack before Russia does. And how will we crack? Well, we will crack as a result of an energy crisis, which is already spilling into an economic crisis. Now, the glass half full part of the analysis is that, do I think that this is the case? Do I think that we will actually crack? And what does cracking actually mean in terms of support for Ukraine? In a sense, the silver lining of the numbers that Guntram was presenting is actually the fact that even if we, and what I mean by we is the we of this specific conversation, the Germany, France's and Italy's of this world, even if we were to crack, we're actually not that consequential. We're certainly not that consequential as far as military assistance is concerned. And I think as far as military assistance is concerned, the real question is the United States. Is the United States going to crack? Is Poland, I mean, you know, Guntram was citing Poland in terms of actual delivery. Is Poland or other East European countries going to crack? Is the United Kingdom going to crack? And I think the answer to that question is probably no. I mean, it's difficult to imagine a political dynamic, even in the event of the energy crisis continuing as it will, of these particular countries actually saying, well, you know, we've kind of changed our mind. We're going to stop providing weapons to Ukraine. Then, of course, there's the broader question of, are we going to crack in terms of not military support, but financial support? I think this is, more of a question to debate. Are we going to crack in terms of saying, well, because of the energy crisis, we're going to pull back? I mean, perhaps we're not going to move forward on sanctions, but are we actually going to pull back on sanctions? And basically saying, well, no, I mean, it was all a joke. We're actually going to lift the sanctions that we have imposed on Russia. I can't imagine that either. So I guess the sort of silver lining to all this is that even in the event, which is a likelihood, of the crisis that we're in, energetically and economically, increasing, as I think it will moving forward, I don't quite see that translating, as Putin probably would like to see, in the kind of cracks that would actually be consequential in terms of the, you know, the trends that I was describing right at the beginning actually materializing. Now, that's as far as the glass half full is concerned. Let me just kind of zoom in on the glass half empty, which of course is the countries that we're talking about here, and in particular my own. Now, as we know, as far as Italy is concerned, you know, Draghi is still in office as, you know, sort of leading the country to election. We'll be voting on the 25th of September. And it is more or less a kind of mathematical certainty, given the electoral law, that the right will win. Now, here, you know, I think sort of a bit of nuance is probably worth highlighting. Does this mean that Italy is going to change its position on Ukraine? I think the answer to that question is actually no. The party that is sort of likely to do best, the Brothers of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. I mean, you know, sort of paradox of paradoxes, our first female prime minister is going to come from a far right party, but anyway. But as far as the war is concerned, as far as the sort of Euro-Atlantic positioning of that party, and in particular of her, is concerned, actually, I'm not particularly worried. There's been a very strong condemnation of Russia, support for Ukraine, including military support for Ukraine. I don't see that changing unless the United States change. I mean, Fratelli d'Italia is close to the Republican Party. It's not close to the Kremlin. Now, the point is what happens to the Republican Party, but that's another conversation. The other two parties that are in that right-wing coalition, i.e. Salvini's Lega and Berlusconi's Forza Italia, have far more compromised relations with the Kremlin, especially Lega. But then again, you know, I could argue, well, these parties have actually been in government. In fact, they are in government. I mean, they are both of them in Draghi's coalition government. So is that going to significantly change? In fact, alongside those two parties that have very close ties to Russia, there was another party, the Five Star Movement, that had as close relations with Russia that was also in government. So I think as far as party politics is concerned, yes, obviously there are reasons to be concerned, but I think not as far as a sort of radical change on the Ukraine war is concerned. What I'm more worried about, and here I'll end, is not this, but rather the fact that without Draghi, Italy is not going to have the same credibility that it had in Europe moving forward. And, you know, if you kind of look back at certain key decisions, let's take the, you know, recognition of Ukraine's EU candidacy. I would say also a sort of significant contribution on the debate on sanctions, especially the sanctions on the Russian central bank. And now the discussion, for instance, on energy price caps. Well, Draghi's Italy, not just Italy, but Draghi's Italy played an important role. And that is, I think, probably gone or going under a Meloni government. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nathalie, for this great overview. And I had to smile when you said, well, you know, if Germany, Italy, and France stop delivering weapons, perhaps it wouldn't make a big difference. And that's, of course, something that I didn't dare saying, but I think it is something that the question that one has to ask. But it matters on the sanctions and, of course, on the financial support and on the overall atmosphere. And so in that sense, of course, the domestic politics in all three countries is going to be hugely consequential also for the future of Ukraine and for the future of the war. And so let me therefore now get Shahin, and then of course I really look forward to debating further all of these issues, and also hear from our audience that many, I guess, are from Germany, how they would assess the German political situation going forward. And I'm, of course, also happy to share my thoughts on that at some stage. Shahin, please.
Well, thank you, Guntram, and thank you, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'll say a few words on the numbers that you shared, Guntram, from Kiel, which I think has done an incredible work, and I want to give them some credit for having arranged a great database of all the support that Ukraine gets, whether it is military, financial, or humanitarian. If I was a French official, I would tell you that France does not disclose the numbers for its military support, and that therefore these numbers are not accurate. My own personal view is that they may be slightly underestimating France's contribution. If you sum up, for instance, the Caesar cannons that France has deployed and sent to Ukraine, you probably get to already nearly the amount that you see on the spreadsheet. So I suspect France has delivered, in fact, more military support than what you see in these numbers. But I think the big message that you shared is correct, which is that the Europeans as a whole have delivered very little in relation to GDP. In fact, it's not even Poland that has delivered the most. It's probably Estonia. I think beyond the numbers, what is also interesting is to look at the quality and the type of weaponry that has been shared with Ukraine. And you see here a clear reluctance for a long time to deliver certain types of weapons. Up until recently, even the US was very reluctant to send long-range artillery and missiles to Ukraine. This has just changed in August, apparently, and this has probably enabled the attack that we have seen on the Saki air base in Crimea, which I think wouldn't have been available with Ukraine's own missile systems, and which wouldn't have been available with the sorts of weapons that the US and Europeans were delivering to Ukraine until now. So that might be a change. The other thing that is very clear is that the US still to this date is reluctant to provide air support. And this was very visible in the early part of the war, when actually Poland as first offered to surrender some of its MiG jet fighters to the Ukrainian air forces in exchange for getting some replacement fighter jets from the US. And it was very clear that the White House declined that offer, and that the White House basically didn't want to provide support to the Ukrainian Air Forces at this point. I think that might be the next thing to crack for the Allied support to Ukraine, whether the Europeans and or the Americans are prepared to provide a greater air support to Ukraine than they have so far. So that's for the military part. I'd like to spend a minute on the financial assistance, because I've been very struck to see that the international community and economic experts have been very quick to talk about how much Ukraine would need financial assistance for reconstruction, and how much a new Marshall Plan would be required to rebuild Ukraine. And in fact, also the extent to which resources that were seized from Russia, and in particular, the freezing of the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, could be mobilized for reconstruction. And while I think all of these issues are intellectually interesting, they seem to me a bit far from the urgency of the matter, which is not rebuilding Ukraine, but which is actually helping financially Ukraine in the short term so that it can actually face the war effort. And you know, I think a lot of the financial assistance that we have seen is largely bilateral. The US has committed a large amount of bilateral financial support to Ukraine, nearly $10 billion. Very little of it has been dispersed, and very little has been dispersed because the international community so far has fallen short of coming together with a real comprehensive plan to provide financial assistance to Ukraine, which would take the form in general, even in a country under conflict, of a large IMF program to which you attach a number of bilateral and multilateral sources of support, whether they come from the World Bank, the EBRD, the IFC, and to which you can attach a number of bilateral sources of support. And so what to me is really critical at the moment, and which is still missing, is to have really a framework to deliver substantial financial assistance to Ukraine, both to stabilize the economy, to allow the Ukrainian government to pay its public servants and nonetheless its military forces, and to supply the basic goods and services that the population needs. I think that framework for delivering financial assistance is still missing, and explains why simple things which were discussed as early as March of this year by the European Central Bank, for instance, which was to offer, for instance, bilateral swap lines to the National Bank of Ukraine, which would ease some of the pressure on central bank reserves and allow the Central Bank of Ukraine to keep its banking system liquid, and to allow citizens, in particular citizens that have fled Ukraine, to continue to use the money that is deposited in the Ukrainian banking system. So all of these things that are pretty basic and in fact pretty critical for a state that is undergoing a war are still missing. And I think it's an important responsibility of European and American leaders to come together with a real plan to deliver that sort of financial assistance. And I think I'll end here and open to questions, but I wanted to bring in this financial perspective, because I think even though you're right, Guntram, to stress the importance and the limited help that Ukraine has been getting when it comes to military assistance, in fact, I think the picture for financial assistance is probably as important as the military one.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shahin. And indeed, this financial issue is totally relevant. We had an op-ed, joint op-ed a few months ago, together with a few colleagues across Europe, on exactly that issue. Without financial support, budgetary support, Ukraine will face a very, very difficult period this winter to uphold its basic services. I mean, that's very clear. So this is absolutely crucial. So let me now invite our audience, our guests, to raise their hands and ask questions. Or of course, you can also write your question in the chat, and I will try to read those questions to our panelists. But we start with those who raise the hand and want to speak themselves. And I think the first I can see is Klaus Wittmann, please.
Yes, good morning. I would like to make a few remarks on German military support, and the question to the speakers and also to our German participants here is, what do you think? Almost 2 weeks ago, on the day of the open door of the federal government, I had the chance in the Kanzleramt to confront Chancellor Kohl personally, and I asked him, Chancellor Scholz personally, and I asked him 3 questions. What about the discrepancy of his public statements about Germany's arms deliveries and the actual statistics which we saw? Secondly, when will he lift his blockade on the combat tanks and APCs, the armored personnel carriers, offered by the industry for months and months already? And then thirdly, I asked whether his statement in the Foreign Affairs Committee that delivery of armored personnel carriers would lead to a terrible escalation allows the conclusion that in their telephone conversations, Putin has intimidated him. Putin, who for none of his aggressive and escalatory steps needed any provocation. So I believe that if in the current counteroffensive in the south, Ukraine fails because of the lack of combat vehicles, we are in part guilty. Already the 88 tanks and 100 APCs that the industry has offered and started to prepare on their own account would make a difference, and I cannot understand the Chancellor's stubbornness. To add one thing, I also said to him, the leadership that you promised, I would not see in pointing to all others and saying they do not deliver this and they do not deliver this, but in the other way around, to say in the Rammstein format, for instance, we would be ready to deliver APCs and tanks if you join us. That would be leadership, I think. What do you think?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Klaus Wittmann. I don't know whether we usually collect a few comments, but I think your point is, of course, a very, very important one. And I think in many respects was implicit in my presentation. So I do think there is a serious question here. I mean, what is the strategy and the goal that Germany currently pursues? Is it to enable Ukraine to defend without being able to regain territory, or is the strategy for Ukraine to actually win this war? And if Ukraine wants to win this war, and if Germany wants Ukraine to win this war, yes, then more serious weapon delivery is necessary. Both in terms of quantity, but also in the type of weaponry. That includes, of course, armored vehicles. It includes tanks, Leopard 2 tanks, etc., etc. And it's clear that if there was more delivery of these kind of weapons, their superiority relative to also the Russian tanks that are currently deployed, which are sometimes very old, would be clear and would be strong. And so yes, I personally think that you raise the right question here. What is the strategy, and what is really the idea, the strategy that Germany, but also France and Italy pursue? And it seems to me that at the moment the support is just insufficient. It's neither here nor there. I mean, it's sufficient to sustain Ukraine, but it's not sufficient for Ukraine to really win this war. And as Nathalie said, it boils down to the Americans and the Brits and the Poles at the moment. I mean, they are the ones that really stop Putin in terms of providing the military capacity to Ukraine. It's not the Central Europeans. But before I go to you, Nathalie and Shahin, perhaps we can take 3 questions in a row. Jonas Heid, Alvidas Medalinskas, and Domniki Diamantopoulos. Jonas, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was also essentially wondering a similar line of thought. What are our excuses at this point for not delivering more? I think at the beginning, there was an argument that, okay, we don't want to deliver long-range weapons that can damage Russian territory, potentially lead to a more direct conflict. But since HIMARS are already there now, why don't we? At this point, there doesn't seem to be an excuse. And also, perhaps, what can we, if anything at all, how can we influence this? How can we, maybe as a DGAP, also put some pressure at the right place? Like, I think everyone's agreed that we need to support more. Well, why is there not more support, and what can we do? Thank you.
Alvidas? You're muted. You're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a political analyst from Lithuania who spends a lot of time in Ukraine. And the last 5 years I spent mainly in Donbass and Mariupol. We worked with the NGO, Ukrainian NGO Donbass Gates. And now because of the occupation, I moved to Odessa, and now I'm now in Odessa. And here I very much cooperate with the National Police, National Guard, military people, border guards, and so on. And I will give you the question, which is really the very often question when you're talking to those people. And we really believe that European military support, it's not enough. Of course, we all think that, economical support, financial support is crucial, because even not waiting for the winter, it is still crucial, because we would, government would like funds to finance the basic needs for the country. But really, going back to this question about the strategy, what is the strategy of, let's say, Germany, France, and maybe some other European countries? And I will provide you the stereotype, which is quite widespread now among those people in military, border guards, police, and so on. They think that maybe it's not enough in order to press upon Ukraine the willingness to start negotiations with Putin, even on not favorable conditions. Because if Ukraine will not get enough military weapons, and it lacks now the artillery and other military, let's say, hardware for the getting better results, then certainly Ukraine might come up and say, look, and Western partners also, look, you cannot achieve too much, so maybe better go for negotiating table with Putin, even if you lose some territory or would get some unfavorable conditions. So I would like to get, let's say, your comments, because I'm now going to meet the head of the National Police in Odessa, and I told him that I will participate in this discussion here.
Thank you. And Dominique, please.
Good morning to everyone. I'm a journalist, an EU editor and analyst from Greece. And I'm wondering, considering the energy crisis that is looming on Europe and the fact that we see that EU governments, one after the other, are actually announcing monstrous support measures to tackle it, will actually the EU states be able to keep financially helping Ukraine? And one more question, will it be easy during this very difficult winter to actually keep the support towards Ukraine on a social level in EU member states? Will this crack perhaps the passionate support from the EU citizens that we've seen so far? Thank you.
Thank you. So Nathalie, perhaps you want to go first, and then Shahin.
Okay, so really interesting questions and reflections above all. Sort of beginning actually with the points that Klaus was making, and then Jonas's question. I think, also in terms of what can we do as kind of think people, I think what we really can and should do is expose the inconsistency and the growing inconsistency of the argument. Argument at the beginning of the war was, and Klaus, you were sort of, hinting at it, is, well, we shouldn't push it too much because of the risk of escalation. And indeed, at the beginning of the war, we didn't quite know what Russia's military capacities were, and it was a, legitimate argument. Well, kind of now we know. We know what Russia does. We know what it can do. As I said, there isn't a rabbit that is going to be pulled out of the hat if we set to one side the nuclear question, which is not necessarily the most effective strategy to gain territory. I think it's kind of, it belongs to simply a different ball game. But in terms of conventional capacities, this is what Russia has. And as I said, I think the trajectory is that of reducing Russian capacities rather than increasing Russian capacities. So the argument of we don't provide military support because this could trigger escalation, the more time passes, the less that argument holds water. And I think that's something that should be exposed. This then connects to Alvidas's question is, well, is the argument then, well, we shouldn't provide too much military support, otherwise Ukraine is not going to have an incentive to negotiate. And I think this is the far more insidious kind of, argument, because it will never be spelled out. Whereas the threat of escalation argument was said openly, and therefore one could argue openly about it, the second argument is never really said explicitly, because frankly speaking, it's really quite an obscene argument, yeah? I mean, we don't support you enough because otherwise you're going to be uncompromising, and that suggests that actually you're not entitled to retake your own territory. I mean, it is such a kind of, from a political and ethical point of view, such a problematic argument that it's never really mentioned explicitly, and because it's not mentioned explicitly, it's difficult to argue against it explicitly. But I think this is the real issue here. I think this is the real problem. And given that it's the real problem, I think it's going to, if we are going to get to that point, it's going to become increasingly obvious, and this connects to Dominique's question. If we get, I mean, sort of, when was it? A couple of months ago, I put out an article on Foreign Affairs where basically I was highlighting this risk, the risk of a situation in which here we are, the war goes on, and we get to a point where Russia indeed does not advance, a counteroffensive is underway, and Russia, which has not been doing up until now, but it could do in the next, 3-4 months, starts putting out, the sirens of negotiations and compromise. At the moment, it hasn't done it, yeah? So at the moment, this is why this more insidious argument has never been made very explicit, because of course, what's the point of asking Ukraine to negotiate if Russia doesn't want to negotiate with it? But what if we get to a point where Russia pretends it wants to negotiate and it wants a compromise? And at that point, we will be in the midst of this energy and economic crisis. Social, societal support may start cracking. And that is the point where, in a sense, the real risk, and I consider it a risk because, I mean, it may sound a little bit odd talking about peace as a risk, but I think it would be a phony peace. It would basically simply be the sort of, giving Russia enough time to reconstitute to some extent its forces and go for kind of round two, maybe in 6 months, 1 year, whatever amount of time. Now, what can we do about that? I think simply kind of, again, exposing that risk, exposing the argument. It's harder to do, as I said, because it's not explicitly aired at the moment, but I think this is the real problem, essentially, that we're facing.
I mean, Nathalie, perhaps before I give to Shahin, I mean, let me just sort of complement two points. I think I very much agree with what you said. I think the first point is that this idea that, I mean, you mentioned the fallacy of thinking that the war could escalate if we delivered more. I think that's a fallacy. I think the opposite is true. But there is also the fallacy of thinking and pretending that by supporting Ukraine somewhat less, one would not be blackmailed on the energy side. And I think that also that fallacy has been completely exposed. I mean, we now know that Putin is fully exploiting his leverage on the European energy market in a very, very harmful way. And we cannot negotiate with him or think that by delivering less, we would get more gas. We are not. And so I think we need to be clear here that the idea that we will get something from Putin, I think is just a wrong idea. The second point, I think that's also important. I mean, this notion that we will at some stage come to, let's say, an offer by Putin where there will be some sort of negotiation and then everything will be fine, I think is also really, frankly speaking, a wrong notion. And it's a wrong notion because we know that if extortioners get away with gains, they will be tempted to do the same thing again over and over. And so this notion that we can come here to a compromise and afterwards, let's say, reestablish a wonderful relation with Putin's Russia, I think is a notion that is really wishful thinking. This is not going to happen. It's going to be. I think our best chance here is really for Ukraine to have decisive gains and in the end a victory, and then to reconstitute a new relation with a different Russia. I think that should be our end game that we should be aiming at least in my view. And so I think, Nathalie, as you said, what's our role as thinkers? I think it's really exposing these inconsistencies, and that's why I think it's really useful to have this conversation this morning. But Shahin, please, contrarian view, perhaps.
No, so there are profound inconsistencies in our positions, but I would like to nuance a little bit what Nathalie said about the risk of escalation. It was clearly, the main reason why we under-delivered, but I don't think we can dismiss it entirely. The risk of escalation in the intensity and the use of weapons is still there. Russia so far hasn't used chemical weapons that we know of, and it probably wouldn't use strategic nuclear weapons, but could use tactical nuclear weapons. So, I think the possibility of that escalation is still there and is still real. Another escalation possible is the internationalization of the conflict. I wouldn't be surprised, and I don't want to scare anyone, if at some point a weapons delivery convoy that flows through Poland on its way to Ukraine would be bombed and attacked on the territory of Poland. This is an entirely plausible scenario, which would inevitably lead to an escalation. I think these risks are real and should not be entirely brushed aside. Now, we can decide to take that risk, but I don't think it's fair to say that these risks don't exist. Now, on the reluctance to deliver weapons to encourage peace negotiations, I think this was a tenable position early in the conflict, and I agree here with Nathalie that this is an increasingly untenable position. In particular, when now Ukraine is saying openly that it wants to retake control of Crimea, and that we are not opposing that. And I don't think we would be well-founded to oppose that claim. But I think it's useful to remember, the history. The reality is that the international community, the EU and the US, basically agreed to restore full diplomatic and full trade relations with Russia when it had basically taken over Crimea and basically had prevented a full return of the Donbass to Ukraine. So the reality is that we've already lived in a world from 2014 up until 2022, where we had made a major concession to Russia. And so now what we are saying now is that we are going to come back on this, and fine. But I think, early on in the war, we basically were starting from a position which was, I think, a point of weakness, but a point of weakness that in fact had been our policy for close to a decade. And so, I think it's very fair to question that, but I think questioning that today implies admitting that we were wrong from 2014 to 2022 and that we'd made an absolute intolerable concession. Now, I'll conclude on one last point, which to me is very important. Even if Ukraine was to achieve military dominance in the next year or so, a war always ends with a peace treaty. And I think this is something that we tend to forget. Even when you win a war, the First World War was ended by a peace treaty. The Second World War was not really ended by a peace treaty, but in reality, there was the equivalent of a peace treaty with the Yalta Conference. So I think we should always keep on the table the fact that even if we support Ukraine militarily a lot more, there will be a moment in time where Ukraine and Russia and probably the US and probably Europeans will have to sit at a table to end this war. And I think it's always important to keep that image in the back of our mind, because there is no war that ends without having the participant and the belligerent sitting around the table and signing out a peace treaty. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Shahin. So let me bring in a few questions from our chat here. So I'll just read them one by one, and please, if I can ask my colleagues to sort of then afterwards pick and choose which questions you will answer. So Daniel Brössler is asking, good morning, a question about the reconstruction effort. Who should be in charge, rather the EU or the US? What role should Germany play? James Willie is asking, well, many thanks to all the speakers for the illuminating presentations. However, there has been no mention of the realistic and realizable political, strategic objectives which the military and financial aid to Ukraine are meant to address. Do Germany, Italy, and France actually have such objectives, other than just creating difficulties for the Russian government? And KP Baumann is asking, well, is here anyone who really believes that Russia will comply to any peace contract? Russia, Putin is lying since 2008, and especially since the Crimea situation. Any Russian soldier on Ukrainian soil is a danger for the Ukrainian people. And Eric confirms what James says. James makes an important point here. What strategy is behind the military aid? What does Russia must not win actually mean? And indeed, I think this term, I never really liked this term because it's really vague. Instead of saying we want Ukraine to win, we're saying Russia must not win, which is not the same thing. And I think it shows the ambiguity that our conversation has highlighted today. And so last but not least, Georg Boomgarden is saying, well, the European military had long been neglected. Defense against Russia depends on the US. What if Putin hopes for an isolationist Republican US administration within 2 years? Then Europe must be able to defend itself. If a Trump clone would declare the UN enemy again and call NATO obsolete again. Okay, so these are a lot of great questions. I mean, perhaps I can just say a word on the last point. On the US situation. I mean, I think the first issue I think there that I would certainly highlight and consider is that no matter who's in the White House, it is not a long-term tenable situation that Europe cannot defend itself. I think we have an obligation to be able to defend ourselves. The United States will more or less be driven by developments in other parts of the world, in particular, of course, in China, and will increasingly have to reshift its focus to that region. And so I mean, even if we were certain that there would be a Democrat government in the White House, I would say we should still, and we do need to invest in our defense capabilities and to do so in a serious way. Germany has announced this 100 billion package to beef up the military capacity. Well, the issue there is basically that the 100 billion is a rather small number if you compare it with the peace dividend that Germany has actually gotten out of the last 30 years, massively reducing its military spending. The University of the Institute in Köln, in Cologne, Institute for Wirtschaft in Köln, has done a study in which they quantify this peace dividend. And depending on how exactly you calculate it, it amounts to 600 to 900 billion. So basically, the lack of military spending and investment in Germany over the last 20 or 30 years weighs on Germany's capacity, certainly, to defend itself. The 100 billion is a good step forward to address some of those issues, but may well not be enough given the severity of the situation. I guess the other point, of course, that has to be raised in that respect is the question, how big is the threat going to be by Russia in the future? And so there, I think the issue we discussed today, namely how this war will end and what kind of defeat or victory will be achieved, of course, also matters hugely for Russia's military capacities going forward, military and political capacities going forward. And so in that sense, every Russian tank destroyed in Russia, in Ukraine, is of course a Russian tank that cannot be used elsewhere. So in that sense, I would say this war matters. But what matters, I think, in the medium to long term is really Europe's capacity to build up its military industrial capacities and basically increase the pipeline and the capacity to build weapons and to provide ammunition, etc., etc. And I think the lack of investment, especially by Germany in the last 20 or 30 years, of course, weighs on our capacities. Okay, so I took one of those. I'm sure you guys want to take perhaps that one as well, but perhaps others. Please, Shahin, perhaps this time first.
Yeah, no, I can only second what you have said about NATO and the US. I think there's this image that, we risk disengagement from the US only in the context of a Trump-like president after Biden. And I want to dispel that. The reality is that the US has been gradually disengaging from the world and from Europe even before Trump. Obama was in retreat, and the discussion we had about 2014 and what we allowed to happen in 2014 in Ukraine, I think, is a good illustration of that. So to me, and I may sound very French in saying that, it is absolutely critical that Europe has the capacity to defend itself, and has the capacity to have a foreign and defense policy that is independent from that of the US. It doesn't mean that the US is no longer an ally. It means that we may at times have divergent views on certain foreign policy and defense options, and we should be able to undertake these options in full independence. I think the question about what is our objective in financial and military assistance is very critical, and I think it's absolutely right that it hasn't been spelled out. And I think now it's becoming a bit more clear, in the sense that I think for a while, and I think that helps, and that goes back to the point that Nathalie made about our inconsistencies. We had an inconsistent policy because we were not sure exactly where we were going. In fact, it was not clear that Europe was supporting Ukraine retaking Crimea. It was not entirely clear where exactly we would set the boundaries insofar as Donbass, given the fact that we had endorsed Minsk agreements that were, forcing Ukraine, at least in principle, to evolve towards a federal-like system. So I think now things are becoming a bit more clear, and they should be spelled out. What we are aiming is the return of Ukraine's full territorial sovereignty, including Crimea and including the whole of Donbass. That, I think, is the territorial objective. And given that President Zelensky has now made that very clear, and there has been no objection to that by European leaders, I think we should assume that this is our common strategy. Where I think things are a bit less clear, and this is the point I was making earlier about a future peace settlement, is assuming Ukraine has taken control over its full territory. What is the peace agreement with Russia going forward? Do we, for instance, stick to some elements of the Minsk agreement, which were seeing some level of decentralization of Ukraine and some level of federalization to ensure the protection of Russian-speaking minorities, for instance? Like, is this still something that we view as part of a possible peace solution, or we don't? And that, to me, are the parts that are not clear, and which I think could be useful. Maybe not now in the middle of a counteroffensive, but in the next few months, right, to spell out more explicitly.
Yeah. Okay. So Nathalie, you have the last word. We are already over time, but perhaps, yeah.
Very, very quickly. I mean, on the European defense transatlantic piece, I agree with what both of you said. I do worry tremendously, though. I mean, I think this war has indicated very clearly how much time we wasted. It's indicated very clearly that for the time being and for the foreseeable future, the defense of Europe is NATO's business. Kind of makes my heart bleed because I worked on European defense tremendously. But I also have to say that beyond the declarations, I'm not quite sure I am yet to see a real sort of step change in terms of, you know, are we really getting it? You know, do we really get what the implications are of where we are and where we're heading? I'm not sure that the answer is that we do get it. I'll put together the sort of reconstruction and sort of strategic objectives. I mean, on the territorial side, I think Shahin has said everything that there is to say. I think then the question is, okay, within a territorially integrous, I'm not sure you say that, Ukraine, what is it that we would like to see? Well, we would like to see a democratic Ukraine that is not an economic black box. Now, this is where the financial support and the EU membership perspective are so important. I think that this war has also signaled, I mean, this, you know, we haven't touched on the enlargement question, but I think it's also signaled that whereas prior to this war, we lived in a magical world in which we kind of thought that there could be this kind of gray zone, which perhaps was not, you know, perfectly democratic and prosperous, but that would more or less be stable. Well, that illusion has been totally shattered by this war. You're either in or out. And given the security implications of being out, you have to be in. And that has all sorts of implications also for us as European Union, which we kind of, you know, shelved for over a decade, you know, I mean, since basically the enlargement to Central and Eastern Europe. On Russia, you know, an idea, an ideology doesn't change. So I don't think that the ball game here is one of imagining a peace treaty in which Putin says, well, yeah, I mean, I kind of changed my mind. You know, I don't want to reconstitute an empire. The point is that this is why the military support and the outcome of the war is so important, is not so much one of choice, but one of having no alternative. Exactly. So we have to, indeed, it's absolutely right. There will be a moment in which there will be a peace treaty, but one in which what we were describing earlier, Ukraine that has its territorial integrity and it has its prospects of being democratic and economically prosperous and clean, if you like, is not only a possibility, but it's a reality. And at that point, yes, okay, indeed, we can talk. But we're very obviously far off from that point. I think I've said everything. I've said the European defense point, so that's it.
Okay, as you can see, we could have continued for another 1 or 2 hours easily, but I'm afraid time is over. So thank you so much, Nathalie, Tocci. Thank you so much, Shahin, Vallée, for joining us this morning, and thank you to all of our members, friends, and funders to join us in this call. The call will be made also publicly available on YouTube in the course of the morning. Thank you, and until next week, bye-bye.